I've been reflecting these past couple of weeks about our UUA president, the Reverend Dr. Sophia Benecourt. Susan was our last president. And Reverend Sophia is, here are some things you may or may not know about her. She is a professor, she is a scholar, and particularly she is an eco-womanist theologian. What is an eco-womanist theologian? So a theologian is someone who does the work of giving language to theology, to beliefs, to systems, of thinking about that which is ultimate. She's a UU theologian in that regard. And she's a womanist. A womanist is a subsect of liberation theology, which is the guiding kind of message of liberation theology is that we are meant to be free, fully free of all that is binding us in, that circumscribes us and our expressions of our humanity or disconnects us to that which is ultimate and sacred. And specifically, women say, one way to understand what liberation looks like and how necessary it is to take and center the experiences of women who are of color and poor. And an eco-womanist is someone who brings in the teachings and the necessities of this earth, of the environmental aspect. And so she combines all of that and has done some really good work from that perspective of eco-womanists in Central America. She wrote an essay in this UU volume called Justice for Earth, and it was really interesting because she was talking about us Unitarians, Universalists. And one of the things that she said is, we are the faith of Thoreau and Emerson, two people who were instrumental in the transcendentalist movement that gave birth to American environmentalism. They helped us think of this land not as a place of resource, but as the source to ultimately connect with the divine, a place of healing and beauty and magnificence, a place where their humanity can experience a type of liberation. So she said, we are descendants and protectors of that legacy. But she also points out in this essay that Thoreau and Emerson, they were also abolitionists. They literally fought for the radical ending of slavery over a decade or 2 decades before the Civil War was fought, at a time when it was not a popular position or a common one for those people who were white or of European descent. And though they were abolitionists and though they were environmentalists, those two parts of their identity did not meet. In fact, Thoreau and Emerson thought that nature was a place to get away from all the ugliness of society. It was to be kept as like a cloistered experience. And she says, and that meant that their experience of the nature never made it into their justice work. And they never thought that really justice work had something to do with their connection with nature. This separation of nature and justice work, or nature and society, was like it was the seed of, it was an inception idea that now often shows in how our work in the environment is not viewed as connected to our anti-racism work or our other abolitionist work today. And so Reverend Sophia Benecourt asks, is there a way that we as Unitarian Universalists can realize that nature has everything to do with our justice-making work? And maybe our justice-making work can help us teach us how to better protect this earth as well. Can there really be an intersection? This challenge is relevant, but it's also interesting to me because I was reading this other work. It was the best spiritual writings of 2005. Took me a little while. And in it, one of the essayists pointed out, who was deeply eco-spiritual, that indigenous peoples across the globe, they weren't just stewards of their ancestral lands. No, they used what they observed in nature to form their theology, to inform their society, to inform their politics. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C., and I thought, you use nature to inform your political decisions? There was no disconnection from them. There was no disconnection, unlike in our ancestors. And so I started to think, where do we see these models of nature playing out in our faith? Where could they show up meaningfully in our societies? Where could there be a kind of natural faith, a natural society? And looking at these different kind of sectors, I thought the place that we hold this integration still the most closely is in our religious practices. There are different seasons for different spiritual postures, but the one I want to point out is Sukkot, which just ended on Friday. And it's a Jewish it comes from a Jewish pilgrimage festival, a time of the harvest. And what's interesting is that Jews, even here, so far, thousands of years and thousands of miles away from their ancient ancestral lands, still build the Sukkot, the temporary shelter that they go and worship in, sometimes sleep in, to be one with all that is around them, to hear the wind coming in to greet them, to see the stars through the spaces in the roof, to know that this is a place to be intimately connected with the ground and creation and their God. It's important, these reminders. That just because these ancient religions and ways point to them does not mean that we always follow them. Robin Wall Kilmer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, who's also an environmental scientist, she tells stories of her family. They're members of she tells stories about her family in Braiding Sweetgrass, how they were forced marched from Kansas to Oklahoma, and that they were able to make that journey because of the nut trees, particularly the pecan trees along the way, that gave them the protein and the strength. And while they were living in Oklahoma, trying to make those lands their home, they still were fed by these nut trees. And in particular, her grandfather faced, it was this time of the Indian Removal Act, where even these First Nations people could not be broken when their land was taken away from them, couldn't be broken when their languages were being denied, and so they took away the most precious thing, their children. And sometimes in a state of near starvation, they'd say, we'll give you some meager food rations if you let us take your child to these boarding schools. And her grandfather wasn't removed, in part because just that year, there was a great flourishing of the pecan trees that allowed them to survive through another harsh winter. And then the US government came and did one other thing. They said, you an offer. You can go and move further out west, and there's territory there for you. And the other thing we're offering you, in addition to the land that we think will be sufficient for farming, is you'll become US citizens. And the First Nation people, the Piscataway people, had been studying the US Constitution and had long realized that the US Constitution provides no protection for First Nation people keeping their land. And yet, the Constitution recognizes the right to private property of its citizens. And so they said, is this way of becoming citizens and being given private land at last the means to keep the land of our people? Even though we have no tradition of private land, even though we recognize communal land is not even sufficient. The land doesn't belong to us. It is of and for everything, including all that crawls and squirms within its dirt and moves upon its surface and flies above it in the air. And so the tribal elders gathered in a circle under the pecan trees to hold a council. Just as they knew back then in their ancient wisdom that the trees had a council of their own. And they talked and they debated, and it was family against family, until finally they decided, yes, we're going to move, and we're going to have this land that we have rights to. And so they moved away, not listening to the trees whispering to them, stand together. It's always better to be in a grove. So they moved out west, and then, didn't you know they had that private land until you couldn't pay your taxes on it, or until someone offers alcohol and some money that seems really good. And so within one generation, they had lost most of the land that they had bargained for. So Robin Wall Kimmerer's grandfather moved back to Oklahoma. There, remembering the story of the grove of trees. All trees stand better and flourish when their roots and their pollen connect them to one another, warning them against danger, telling them when it's time to fruit and bear and be abundance. A lesson that her people have now learned the hard way. What is nature telling us to model in our own lives about making decisions for our people? On vacation, I was also reading this book about fascism and faith in fascist countries. I'm an eclectic reader. But this filters in too, which is thinking about our political systems. And I was thinking about what kind of political system does nature model for us? In no political system does one species make decisions for all the other species. Doesn't happen. In no environment is one species, besides humans, so dominant that it throws the entire balance out of whack. You might have seen these stories about wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, right? Just one little pack of like 5 or 6 wolves. And do you know what started to happen? The grasses started to come back. Native species of plants flourished because the elk and all the little plant eaters were now in balance with the plants, and the whole ecosystem was restored. But even in a system with a top predator, that top species, only in humans do they eat or take beyond what they need. There is never a gluttony of want and power. How can we be like that in our economic systems? How can our political systems recognize that the whole system is best when all contribute, when all have a say, when all have a place? Perhaps like American environmentalism began with Unitarian Universalists, perhaps we too can begin to model for our greater society that we need to pay attention for how earth and justice meet. Last week, I joined Unitarian Universalists from across the country, a small band, but mighty, to advocate for the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a very interesting and vast bill. Mostly, it's about food subsidies and supports for those who are low income and hungry. But it's also too often about subsidizing a few mega farms who grow not food for our bodies, but fuel and feed for other animals. And so, as Unitarian Universalists, we said we could play a really important role, advocating essentially for just two main points. One is that all farmers, including small farmers and farmers of color and those who have been generally pushed out of farming, should have the same level of access to governmental financial supports for their farms and their conservation work. Because right now it's like, if you don't have 1,000 acres, you basically don't get government subsidies. You could guess who has 1,000 acres and who doesn't. And that let us actually have the money that our government has said for conservation be used for things that will actually help our air and help our water and help our soil strength. You don't want to know it? Almost nobody else is advocating for these pieces, recognizing that what's good for our people is what's good for our planet, and what's good for our planet is good for our people. And so I invite us to look around a little bit more, to pay attention to how nature works in this world for harmony and balance and inclusion, and let it be so for us. And let us make it so together for us and for our people and for this glorious earth. May it be so, and amen.
Our connection question today is, what model from nature do you want us to practice as a faith or society?